series, Transforming Criminal Justice in Illinois and Beyond, hosted by the Northwestern Prison Education Program. So the Northwestern Prison Education Program, or NPEP, is a partnership between Northwestern University and Oakton Community College to provide a comprehensive liberal arts education to people who are incarcerated in Illinois. But as we reckon with the United States' pernicious investment in policing, criminalization, and incarceration, what we aim to do with this series is create space to hear from some of the leading voices on these issues. So this is the first in a 4-part series. So we hope that you'll be able to join us for the remaining ones, which you can find more information about on our website. And we can leave the website address in the chat. So I want to thank our speakers for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Ari to introduce them.
Actually, I'm going to turn it back over to Arturo. But welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, so I'll introduce our first speaker, Jobi Cates. Jobi is Executive Director and founder of Restore Justice, a statewide criminal justice reform organization focused on long-term incarceration and its impact on individuals, families, and communities. From 2008 to 2014, Jobi was the Senior Director of the Chicago and Midwest Regional Office of Human Rights Watch. And in her role there, she led legislative and communicative efforts on a broad-based coalition to end the practice of sentencing children who commit serious crimes to life without parole. So Jobi has extensive nonprofit leadership experience, including as Executive Director of the Illinois Caucus for Adolescent Health and Executive Director of the Meyer Morris Kaplan Family Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jobi.
Thank you. I didn't think I was going to have to go first. I was going to bask in the glory of my other co-panelists and then just add a few words, but So here we go. No basking for me today. So thank you for inviting me to join your panel. The last time Jennifer invited me to do something was several years ago. Jennifer invited me to come and speak to her class in Stateville. And this story is going somewhere, by the way. I was blocked. I was banned from going. I'm not allowed to go speak to a class at Stateville for Jennifer because I'm not allowed to do any kind of volunteer work within the Department of Corrections. Why, you might ask? It's not because of my, criminal background or anything like that. It's because I have friends who are incarcerated and I visit them regularly. And the department has a rule that doesn't allow people who have friend relationships or familial relationships, visitation sort of relationships with people in prison to do volunteer work and vice versa. And this is just one example of 1,000 small, meaningless, pointless slights that people in prison and their loved ones experience every day. And when I was asked to do this panel, one of the first kind of sort of prompting questions was, why did you start Restore Justice? Why did you found this organization? And it goes back to a story not dissimilar. When I found out about the rule that doesn't allow, that it means that I can't do a class at Stateville because I have a friend at Menard Correctional Center, it inspired me to start developing some policy ideas for how we might get rid of that damn rule in the state of Illinois. And the genesis of Restore Justice is the same. As Arturo mentioned in my bio, I had been working at Human Rights Watch at a time when a good deal of research was being done about juveniles serving extreme sentences in Illinois. This is following the Supreme Court case Roper that made the death penalty for juveniles unconstitutional, and preceded a body of work that came before the Supreme Court, changing sort of the rules about how juveniles are treated in adult court for serious crimes. And as part of that work at Human Rights Watch, I found myself sitting at a table at Northwestern Law School at the Children and Family Justice Clinic, which hopefully many of you are a part of in some way, shape, or form, next to a woman named Julie Anderson, whose son was serving life without parole for a crime he committed at the age of 15. And I am a mom, I have 2 kids, and Julie and I became friends. And when Julie told me about her son's situation, I had that same feeling that I had finding out that I wasn't allowed to give a class at Stateville. That feeling of, first, what? No, that can't be a thing. And second, oh my God, how many people are living with this? How are people getting around this? It's ridiculous. And third, let's fix it. When Julie told me about her son's case, he was 15 years old. He's sort of a classic juvenile life without parole case. I became a little bit obsessed with this coalition. And so I got to know a number of lawyers, people with decades of experience in Cook County and in the state appellate defender's office defending these guys who were just desperate, had no way to break into the policymaking system from where they were sitting at the university. I met moms who were absolutely beside themselves, decades waiting for their children to get any kind of recognition that they were human from the system. And after a few years of working with them on the coalition from my nice comfy chair at Human Rights Watch, my well-padded, paid-for chair, my not loaned chair in my paid-for office in my nice little nest, I had a moment actually with my colleagues where a number of us sitting around together said, we can't do this from Northwestern and from Human Rights Watch. We have to do this as a distinct organization. The state does not have an advocacy voice in Springfield, a lobbyist, a 501c4 lobbying organization whose sole priority is people serving longer sentences. It just doesn't exist. So every policy change in the state was based on the sort of tinkering around the edges of important, I shouldn't say tinkering, it's I don't want to diminish the important work that's being done, but really looking at the low-hanging fruit of the criminal legal system, everything from retail theft to all the different types of reforms that try to chip away at some of the barriers to reentry. Those are very important things, but absolutely no one was looking at extreme sentencing in Illinois. I do think that there were people who cared about it deeply and who were working on it in different ways, but not in Springfield, not where legislators were listening. So we decided to take a leap, and together we formed Restore Justice Illinois, which was not meant to be a charitable organization. It was meant to be a lobbying organization. So we registered as a 501c4. And within a year, we had realized that we needed to grow, that the problem was far more complex than we had thought, and that we were going to need more than lobbying, which was an unpleasant surprise to me because I didn't at the time think that I could handle starting a new organization and getting it up and off the ground. But we did it. And we are now in our 5th full year of operations. We've passed 2 major pieces of legislation that changed the game in Illinois, that changed the norms in Illinois courts, not in pervasive, big, flashy ways that you might, it's not like we abolished the death penalty. It's not like that. We've not had any kind of showcase legislation like that. What we have done is we sort of started deconstructing juvenile life without parole. What I mean by that is, you come into this field, you're Jobi, you're working at Human Rights Watch, you're making good money, you got benefits, your chair's paid for. It's pretty nice. And then you find out that they're locking up kids for life. Ah, crap, I gotta do something about that. You quit your job, you go raise some money, start this thing. And what started off as legislative efforts by this little ragtag group to end juvenile life without parole had to become bigger. Why? Why did it have to become bigger? It had to become bigger because we went to Springfield, and for the first time in 2012, after the Miller v. Alabama case, which I can talk about later if anyone wants to know more about it, if you don't already, we thought we had an easy in. The U.S. Supreme Court had put wind beneath our wings. They had said states have to change the way they're sentencing juveniles in adult court. They can no longer give mandatory life without parole sentences. And we drafted some legislation and we marched ourselves to Springfield. And the state's attorneys literally laughed us out of the room. We had 2 of the most powerful sponsors in Springfield. We didn't have the newbie 37th guy to the left. We had the House Majority Leader and we had the Senate Majority Leader as our sponsors, which, someday if you're ever doing this work, you'll go, wow, that was a big deal. All I could do is tell you, trust me, that was a big deal. We got laughed out of the room. The prosecutors had never been challenged in Springfield on these larger issues, and they knew that we didn't have the votes. We didn't know that we didn't have the votes to pass anything that would actually change juvenile life without parole, even with a US Supreme Court case telling the state they had to. So that was when we started realizing, uh-oh, we're going to have to do a little bit more than we thought. This isn't going to be easy. Over time, as we started deconstructing why they were laughing at us, why were they laughing at us? Why didn't we have the votes? Why would anyone want to lock up a 15-year-old for life? We realized that juvenile life without parole was, I realized, my lawyer friends all knew this already, by the way. I realized that the tip of the iceberg was juvenile life without parole. And the iceberg was made up of everything from our state getting rid of parole as a mechanism for release in 1978. So we've had determinate sentencing in the state since 1978. It's made up of truth in sentencing policy in 1998 that took away most time off for good behavior and all of it for people who committed serious or violent offenses. It's made up of the felony murder rule, which I'll talk about a little more before I close. It's made up of accountability policy and accountability theory. It's made up of all sorts of, prosecutorial power and judicial and no judicial discretion. And you guys could write the book, right? No, I think Marc has written the book, in fact. So thank you, Marc. So that tip of the iceberg is these little words, juvenile life without parole. And the way the law works, I'm not a lawyer, but I think you guys know this better than I do. The way the law works, juvenile life without parole is 4 words that specify a category of people, which in Illinois encompassed 103 individuals when I started this work. Life without parole for young people encompasses thousands of people in the common sense mind, not in the legal definition. There are thousands of people in Illinois serving what amounts to a life sentence for things they did when they were too young to know any better, or before they had the ability to really make a good decision. Those people are not helped by ending JLWAP. So one of the reasons we were being laughed out of the room was because Matt Jones, the very, very clever lobbyist for the State's Attorneys Association of Illinois, who's a wonderful negotiating foe and we've learned a great deal from him over the years. Matt produced a chart that showed us how little impact abolishing life without parole would have, how little impact it would have. And so we started pulling the threads, and we got a little bit smarter and a little bit savvier, and year after year, we've introduced pieces of legislation with sponsors who were committed and willing to go the long distance with us that chipped away at the iceberg rather than just attacking the top and the tip of the iceberg, if that makes sense. One of the policies that makes up the iceberg that I was specifically asked to speak about today by our organizing team here was the felony murder rule. And I'll just really briefly say that the felony murder rule is a very common statute in the United States. I think more than 40 states have some sort of felony murder rule. Most of them create the ability to charge an individual with first-degree murder for a death that is the result of their participation in an underlying felony. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so you guys can look it up and do fancier word work with that. But what it means is Arturo and I are buddies. We don't know each other that well. We met once or twice. We decided to go steal a car together because that sounds like fun. We're 17, 18, 19, whatever. Arturo and I go out and steal a car. Now, what Arturo doesn't know is I'm a total hair trigger. I also pack a gun. He doesn't know that. But I had a bad day. And we go out to steal the car, and the police come. And a bystander is shot in a shootout between me and the police. Arturo's freaking out. He's hiding behind the car. He doesn't know what's going on. Who is that girl, Jobi, anyway? And why am I hanging out with her on a Friday night? I don't know. When all is settled and done, the bystander's dead. The cops are alive. I'm alive. Arturo's alive. And Arturo's on the hook for first-degree murder under the felony murder rule in Illinois. That's just the essence of that policy. It's a wonderful way. It's like a really wonderful way for prosecutors to be able to charge up as many people as they can in one given kind of group offense. There was a major case here in Illinois, if you were here about a year ago before COVID, if you can remember a time before COVID, let us think. What were we doing in August of 2019? In August of 2019, we were looking at a case of 6 kids who went up to Lake County from Cook County to steal a car. Gentleman came out of his home when he saw 6 kids monkeying with his car. He had a shotgun. He fired into the group of the 6 kids to get them away from his car, presumably, and killed one of the kids. That was in the middle of the night on the 14th of August. In the morning of the 15th of August, State's Attorney Nierheim in Lake County had charged the other 5 kids with the death of their friend. They charged them with first-degree murder, the death of their friend, using the felony murder rule as a way to justify that charge. Now, why did he do that? He did that because he wants people in Lake County to know that he's not going to stand for some kids from the city coming up to Lake County, which is largely white, and that part of Lake County in particular, stealing their cars. What nobody was really looking at that time, who immediately saw the case, was the fact that those kids had lives. They're human beings. They just lost, what we found out later was their cousin. He was the youngest of the 6. He was dead. He died in one of the younger boy's arms. Those kids could have done life, or what amounts to life in their cases, for his murder. They didn't kill their friend. They didn't have a gun in the car. They didn't bring the gun to the party. So the felony murder rule is one of those tools that prosecutors love to have in their toolkit, so that they can make big statements, so that they can presumably they want to deter crime, although we know from research it doesn't really deter crime. So anyway, I'm going to close up with the final question that I was asked to consider before this panel, which is, what is the role of nonprofit organizations in promoting change? This is the answer. It's this felony murder case is a classic example of how kids and young people who are usually offending in packs, we all know the pack mentality of teenagers. I have a teenager in my house, so I can speak intimately to it right now. Kids do stuff in groups. They go out, they make some trouble, some bad things happen. When you get them charged up, everybody's getting charged with first-degree murder now instead of, instead of, what do you call it? I'm losing the word. Instead of a lesser crime. Those kids' lives are all impacted forever. What we did as a nonprofit organization to make change is we stepped in and we said, this is part of our mission. These kids would be getting an extreme sentence. We have 2 pieces of legislation with 2 different sponsors providing 2 different alternative solutions to the felony murder problem in Illinois, because we like to be pragmatic and we want to actually help people. So we want our legislation to actually pass. We don't want it to be sitting there year after year after year. We want to pass legislation that's going to actually help people. We picked up that case and we ran with it in the press. We used the case to educate legislators about the felony murder rule and the potential harm it can have. We drove a campaign that led to pretty unprecedentedly quick subject matter hearing, and we were pushing toward passing at least the lesser pieces of the legislation in the March session when COVID hit and shut down our legislature. So this would have been, I think, a bigger success story if we hadn't shut down the state. But I'll close by saying our role is to not give up, because the prosecutors have been running the board in our state for decades and decades and decades. And we've only had 5 years to chip away at this iceberg. So our role is to not give up. Our role is to come back year after year. It's not to pick on the flavor of the month. It's not to go along with whatever's big in the moment. It's to chug away at the pieces of this iceberg that are some of the most harmful, most bigoted, most egregious abuses in our society, and to keep coming back until it's not an iceberg anymore. I'm going to stop there, and I really am grateful for having had the chance to speak. I could talk a lot about COVID. I really want to talk about COVID, but I've talked too long already, so I'm going to pause, and maybe we'll get to talk about COVID later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joey. And now we have our next speaker, Marc Mauer. Marc is the former executive director of the Sentencing Project and a leading expert on sentencing policy, race, and the criminal justice system. He has directed programs on criminal justice policy reform for 40 years and is the author of several publications in the field, including Race to Incarcerate, Invisible Punishment, and the Meaning of Life, the Case for Abolishing Life Sentences. As senior advisor, Marc provides strategic support to the Sentencing Project's efforts to reform felony disenfranchisement policies and the campaign to end life imprisonment. Thanks so much for joining us, Marc.
Great, thanks for having me here. You know, I've come to appreciate getting the introductions right to these things. Arturo mentioned one of my books, Race to Incarcerate. And when the book was first published, I was giving a talk at one of the bookstores in Washington, and a notice went out about the event and said Marc Mauer will be speaking about his new book, Race to Incinerate. And so we had a variety of issues and audiences there and stuff like that, but thank you for getting that right. Thanks for having me also, and thanks for the interest of all the organizers and participants in excessive sentencing, which I really think is one of the critical ideas that we need to be coalescing around and strategizing around and figure out how we can deal with this in the context of mass incarceration. You know, let me try to paint the picture of the current scene as I see it in terms of the justice reform movement. You know, over the last decade or so, we've seen increasing critiques of mass incarceration coming from a variety of different directions. Politically, it's increasingly bipartisan. You know, as you probably know, in Congress 2 years ago, the First Step Act was passed. It's a very modest reform, but nonetheless, it had, you know, bipartisan support for doing things differently and, you know, moderating some of the excessive sentences in the federal system. Many states have adopted a variety of reforms themselves, and, you know, the political climate around these issues has certainly shifted. Not to mention in this year, and just, you know, the enormous outrage nationally around policing and incarceration and the like, and putting, you know, renewed pressure on policymakers to change things. So we've seen a shift in public opinion, in political opinion, and yet if we look at the numbers of people in prison, the change is relatively modest, particularly when we think of, you know, since the mid-1990s, the crime rate around the country has fallen quite sharply, roughly 40% decline, both overall and for violent crime too. And a handful of states have achieved significant reductions in their prison systems. New York, New Jersey, California, 30 to 35% reduction. Connecticut has cut its population in half. These are all encouraging developments, but overall, while most states have reduced their prison population, it's typically in the single digits, and nationally it's a reduction of 1 or 2% a year, no more than that. So how can we understand this? Why, you know, with so much less crime taking place, why haven't we seen greater reductions? You would ordinarily think these should be connected with each other. Well, I think part of the reason has to do with sort of perceptions, both of policymakers and sometimes advocacy organizations alike, in defining who the targets are for reductions. And, you know, we frequently will hear, well, we shouldn't have any first-time, low-level, nonviolent drug offenders in prison, that whole story. And, you know, here's the big secret. There aren't that many first-time, low-level, nonviolent drug offenders in prison. You know, courts now have drug courts, and there's diversion programs and the like, and support for keeping some first-time people out of prison. Even with more serious drug offenses, the population in prison today serving time for drug offenses in the range of 15 to 20%. And so I'm wholeheartedly supportive of the critique of the war on drugs. I believe there are far too many people in prison for drug offense. even if we decriminalize drugs tomorrow and everybody got to leave prison, we would still have mass incarceration. And the fact is, especially if we look at state prison populations, half the people in prison today are serving time for a violent offense. Now, for a lot of people, that's the end of the conversation. You know, we can't even think about dealing with violent offenses and all, and, you know, that's not part of the agenda. And I think that's not the end of the conversation. It should be the beginning of the conversation. Because if we look at how mass incarceration developed, it's complicated. There's lots of changes in policy and practice. But fundamentally, it means policies designed to send more people to prison and keep them there for longer periods of time. So in the first part of that equation, sending people to prison, we've had, you know, some relative success. There's various alternatives to incarceration, diversion programs, and some are more effective than others, but at least there's attention to that. But on the second half, about how much time people spend in prison, there's been much less attention, and I think, unfortunately, much less success in achieving that. You know, these changes have come about from very specific sentencing policy changes at the federal level in virtually every state. So it's mandatory sentencing, 3 strikes and you're out, cutbacks in parole release and the like. You know, on 3 strikes and you're out, many of you know about half the states have some type of policy like this, but California's is by far the broadest in the country. In California, the law had been your first 2 strikes needed to be serious or violent. Your third one could be any felony in the state of California. So in 2003, there were 2 cases that came to the US Supreme Court arguing that the 3 strikes policy was cruel and unusual. In the first case, the man's 3rd strike had been stealing 3 golf clubs from a sporting goods store. He was wearing baggy pants. He stuck the golf clubs down his pants, walked out, was immediately apprehended. The second one, a man stole $153 worth of videotapes from a Kmart store. Both of them 3 strikes cases. The court looked at their cases and rejected the argument about cruel and unusual, and essentially their decision said, if this is what the legislators in California believe is necessary to promote public safety, we don't want to be second guessing them on that. So the golf club thief is doing 25 to life and the videotape thief is doing 50 to life. This is what these policies have brought. Now, I don't want to suggest that most people in prison on life sentences have stolen golf clubs and videotapes. That's not the case. But through the research we've done at the Sentencing Project, we now find that 1 of every 7 people in prison nationally is serving a life sentence. 206,000 people we're talking about. Some of these are explicitly life without parole, some are life with the possibility of parole, and some of them are what we call virtual sentences, where the sentence is 50 years or more, so it essentially equates to a life sentence. Now, while some people serving life have been convicted of drug or property offenses, it is the case the vast majority have been convicted of violent or serious offenses. And presumably under the guise of promoting public safety, that's why they have a life sentence. I believe that life sentences and many excessive sentences are actually counterproductive for public safety. There are several reasons for this. Probably the most significant is who gets involved in crime. Criminologists have known for 100 years that people age out of crime. So essentially young men, sometimes young women between the ages of 15 and 24 commit a disproportionate amount of crime. And this cuts across lines of race and class and nationality across the board, whether it's hormonal or whether it's structural in society. We don't know precisely, but young men, late teens, commit a disproportionate amount of crime. these crime rates rise pretty sharply in the late teens, early 20s, but then they start to fall quite dramatically by the late 20s and 30s, certainly by 40s, 50s, and 60s. So if we have someone convicted of armed robbery at the age of 25 who gets, let's say, a 30-year sentence in prison for the armed robbery, by the time that young man is 35, 40, 45, in most cases, not every last one, in most cases, he is far less of a threat to public safety than that 25-year-old was when he committed the armed robbery. And so what that means is that we have diminishing returns for public safety. Every additional year we keep that person in prison, we're preventing less and less crime. And it's also coming at a greater cost each year, primarily because people's health in prison doesn't do very well, not surprisingly. So we're paying more and more money for health care for these people in prison. So we're getting far less for our money. This results in the diversion of resources. We have, every year a group of 14, 15, 16-year-olds about to enter those high crime rate years. There are things we could do to intervene, supports we could provide to their families and communities to get better outcomes, both for their life prospects, but also for public safety. And yet we're investing enormous sums at the back end of the system on middle-aged and elderly people. Another reason why life sentences and extreme sentences don't work is that we look at the whole concept of deterrence. And, we've all heard legislators say, I'm going to increase the penalty for this, so we'll send a message to, the criminal population, as they would put it, that we don't want to put up with this. Well, again, in criminology, we've known for 100 years that whatever deterrent effect the justice system have is a function of the certainty of punishment, not the severity of punishment. If we can somehow increase the odds that somebody will be apprehended, some people might think twice about their crime, whether it's a shoplifting or a murder or anything in between. But since most people don't expect to be caught, many people commit their crimes under the influence of drugs or alcohol and aren't thinking about the consequences. Merely increasing the amount of punishment has very little impact. So again, we're putting enormous resource in the back end, very little effect. It's important, I think, to point out that as is true of mass incarceration, as is true of our use of the death penalty in the US, the United States is far out of line in international standards in how it uses life sentences. Our 206,000 life sentences represent about 40% of life sentences internationally. In Western Europe, it's very unusual, either by law or in practice, for anyone to get more than 20 years in prison, whereas you can go into any courthouse in America any given day and see somebody going to prison 20 years for a drug offense or something. That's also not a high-profile violent offense, too. So it's not that other countries don't have people committing violent, serious offenses. It's just that they have less faith that more punishment will solve the problem. And we certainly have no evidence that more punishment has been effective. In terms of what we can do about this at the Sentencing Project, we've done a series of reports over 15 years. My colleague Ashley Nellis and I wrote a book 2 years ago called The Meaning of Life, the case for abolishing life sentences. And we've started a campaign to end life sentences. And you can see our website at endlifeimprisonment.org. We have proposed that we should set a maximum 20-year prison term, except in unusual cases. And again, based on this whole concept of people aging out of crime, and by 20 years in prison, the vast majority of people should be much less of a threat to public safety and could be good candidates for release back to their communities if we put more resources into reentry programming, dealing with occupational issues, educational issues while they're in prison too. Many states and advocacy groups are now looking at second look policies. Congress, Senator Cory Booker has introduced legislation. Basically, here's a way to deal with, life sentences, mandatory penalties, to provide an option to give the court a second look after a period of time. The problem with extreme sentences, on the day of sentencing, no one in the courtroom, judge, the prosecutor, the defense attorney, even the defendant himself or herself, knows what that person's going to be like in 10 or 15 or 20 years. So under second look provisions, you could come back into court. Federal law would do it at 10 years. Some states are talking in 20 or 25 years. So a judge could reconsider based on your maturity, based on your accomplishments in prison and the like. And there's no logical reason why we shouldn't permit that as an opportunity for people. The judge is not required to go along with it, but why not consider those kinds of things? So I think increasingly we're seeing more discussion about these issues of excessive sentencing. I think we need to communicate both to policymakers and, again, sometimes our friends and advocacy organizations that just ending the war on drugs, which is not easy, is not enough. We need to take a much broader view and talking about punishment broadly speaking. Why do we punish people so much more than other nations did, and so much more than even we did in the US not that long ago? So I looking forward to the discussion. Thanks for having me again.
Great, thanks so much, Marc. And now we'll move on to our next speaker, Jennifer Soble. Jennifer is a criminal defense attorney and policy lawyer based in Chicago, Illinois. Prior to starting the Illinois Prison Project, Jennifer was an assistant federal defender in the Northern District of Indiana, where she represented indigent clients charged with serious federal crimes and specialized in forensic issues, juveniles charged as adults, and sentencing law. Jennifer also served as senior legal counsel for the Justice Collaborative. Before becoming a federal defender, Jennifer was a visiting clinical professor at the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law's Blue Legal Clinic, focusing on juvenile and criminal justice. Thanks so much for joining us today, Jennifer.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a huge honor to be on a panel with Marc and Jobi, both of whom are personal heroes. Marc, I didn't want to embarrass you, but I'm looking at your book. I was going to wave it in front of the screen and everyone should read it. So I am the founder of a group called the Illinois Prison Project. We are completely, solely dedicated to bringing lawyers into the spaces that Marc and Jobi so accurately and heartbreakingly described, lest anyone think that Illinois gets off without a hitch and we're in a blue state, and so we get to be sort of not implicated in this horror show that we call the carceral state. Illinois is responsible for 10% of the country's life and virtual life sentences. We have 4,500 people in our prisons right now serving, either a third of them are serving natural life, will die in prison no matter what, even if they live to be 800 years old. And another 2/3 are serving virtual life sentences. As Marc noted, there's been very little reform around sentence length. There's been even less reform around sort of back end stuff. And by back end, I mean after conviction, after sentencing. And so we have this prison system that is the result of decades of really regressive punitive sentencing policies. And even if we make progress going forward, we as a legal society have done literally nothing in almost every case to help folks who have already been harmed by this system, right? And so I want to focus on the three strikes law that Marc was describing. We absolutely have it here in Illinois. It's called the Habitual Offender Statute. It says that on your third Class X offense, you are eligible for a natural life sentence. As I'm sure will surprise everyone on this call, when it was used in Illinois, it was almost exclusively used against Black and brown people. When it was used in Illinois, it was almost exclusively used against people who exercised their right to trial. And what those practices meant is that here in Illinois right now, we have hundreds of people serving natural life sentences for things like gas station robberies, or we have a client right now who's serving a natural life sentence for having 5 grams of crack cocaine in his own apartment. We have clients who are serving natural life sentences for robbing a homeless man of $25 at knife point. The money was recovered. These are all clients who are in prison today with literally no hope of getting out because of a racist and regressive sentencing practice. All of these clients have, of course, exhausted over and over and over again every sort of judicial avenue that they have for release. They all work about as well as they were designed to work, which is not very well, right? Our legal system respects finality far, far higher than it respects human life. And so what my organization, it does, and what we were designed to do, because I designed it, which is sort of cool, is to bring lawyers into this like back end space, this space where there are no traditional legal remedies, and to try to use some creative and novel approaches to getting folks out of prison. We focus primarily, we have sort of 3 big focus areas, 2 of which are really pertinent to this conversation. One is the folks serving natural life sentences for their 3rd strike here in Illinois. We have about 150 of those clients. In the last couple of months, we have gotten commutation orders for 16 of them. And 13 of the 16 are already home, which is amazing. The other 5 have been sent to the parole board, which is weird, yay, because Illinois doesn't really have parole, but we still have this parole board that like kicks around from back pre-1978 when we used to have parole. And one of our sort of big top line goals, very aligned with Jobi's and Restore Justice's goal, is to get more folks eligible for parole so that we can start rebuilding this some sort of structure, some sort of mechanism to give, to look at these sentences after 20 years, after 30 years, after 5 years, right? People change really dramatically and our sort of life situations change. And it's really important to be able to have a mechanism and a legal system that recognizes that. Another campaign that we have going on right now is elderly veterans. So these are folks who have been in prison for more than 20 years, who are elderly, who would all be eligible for like VA benefits and healthcare and jobs and housing if we could just get them out of prison. And then our 3rd campaign, which is a little bit less on the nose for today, but will become important for you guys hopefully next month, is representing people who were prosecuted for very low level conduct after being placed in solitary confinement, every single one of whom is mentally ill. So I know you guys have a panel coming up next month with Anthony Gay, Scott Main, who I can see on this call, and I were his attorneys back in the day. But to talk a little bit more about our other folks. So I'm supposed to tell you what our main efforts are. Those are it. And the reason that we're doing this is because as Marc sort of described, long-term incarcerative practices are not only fiscally ridiculous, they don't do anything to make us safer because people age out of prison, as we've talked about. They also completely disregard the enormous potential for growth and change and rehabilitation that every human being has. And one person I'm supposed to talk about, and I would love to talk about, and I'm so happy to talk about, and he's here right now, is our client, Renaldo Hudson. Renaldo was he was sentenced to die. He was given the death penalty when he was 19 years old after he murdered an elderly man. Renaldo had, I would say, the most heartbreaking childhood I've personally ever come across, and I've been a criminal lawyer for a really long time, and was very much a product of trauma, of intergenerational family violence, of sexual abuse, of human trafficking, of drug addiction, of homelessness, of poverty. And he committed a murder at 19, and through a sort of series of breakdowns in the judicial legal system, he ended up with a death sentence. His really wonderful lawyer died while his case was pending, and the whole thing just sort of got derailed. He was on death row until 2003 when Governor Ryan commuted all of the death sentences, thank goodness. And between 1995 and last month, Renaldo was this sort of like remarkable figure, went through this amazing transformation within the Department of Corrections. He started programming for other inmates. He started Stateville Speaks, which is the prison newspaper that has given rise to a bunch of other prison newspapers throughout the country. He's been featured in like every single major newspaper. There have been documentaries about him. There's like a movie about him. He's really great, and he's here. And he is, you know, not every person in prison or outside of prison can be Renaldo Hudson, and goodness, if we even tried. But he is sort of, you know, my favorite example of what the human spirit is capable of, and what we as a society reject when we create a carceral system that does not allow for review. Thank goodness we were able to bring Renaldo's story before Governor Pritzker in a compelling enough way that we were able to get him out of prison. But the way that our system currently works, that's just not possible for the 38,000 people in the Department of Corrections, because there are not enough lawyers doing this work. There are not enough folks in the governor's office and the prisoner review board whose sole job it is to like think critically about whether or not this person really needs to remain in prison, because we've built a system that assumes continued incarceration. So I don't know if it's appropriate for Renaldo to say hi, but at some point you should, and there will be, like, you know, Renaldo is not out in the world, and so y'all are going to be hearing a lot from him, whether you want to or not, but I promise you want to. And so that's sort of, you know, I'm supposed to tell you about the current state of the carceral system in Illinois, and what's changed in the last couple of years. And maybe Renaldo has thoughts about this too. The current situation is pretty dismal, not gonna lie, it's really rough. We have a, 94% of the people in Illinois are serving a sentence who are incarcerated for murder, and that's 6,900 people right now are serving a sentence of greater than 20 years. The average number of time served, the average years of time served for people released a couple of years ago for murder was 14 years. 94% of people convicted in Illinois are serving greater than 20 years, and we don't have parole, as we talked about. You also can't earn good time on a murder sentence if you were convicted after 1999. So as a state, 94% of our people convicted of murder are serving sentences that are longer by almost half than the average sentence in the country. We, for that reason, because we incarcerate far too many people for far, far, far too long, our prison system is very overcrowded with elderly folks. 20% of our prison population is elderly. If you think about what that means, 1 in 5 people in the prison system is substantially more likely to need a wheelchair, is substantially more likely to have a chronic disease, is substantially more likely to be disabled in some other way, or to become disabled, right? And so even just thinking about like recidivism and the fact that elderly people do not recidivate, they have a recidivism rate after long-term incarceration of like very close to 0. We're in a situation where our prison system is completely burdened with the job of trying to protect and care for people that they definitely cannot protect or care for. In part because of that, there are substantially fewer resources to help folks rehabilitate, spend money towards programming. And even if we did have all of the resources put towards programming, we have no systems in place to incentivize that programming, to reward that programming, or to acknowledge the growth that so many wonderful people who are stuck in this cycle of incarceration experience when they have the tools at their disposal to do so. One huge answer is parole. There are a bunch of groups, and you know, we're just the lawyers. We just do direct representation and some advocacy. We don't do legislation. There's so many other wonderful groups occupying that space. But in the past couple of years, there have been groups who have tried to bring parole back to Illinois. I think Jobi can say better, but I think there were hearings today on one of the several competing parole bills.
No? It was a subject matter hearing in general on parole and a number of other issues. It wasn't a bill-specific hearing. But yeah, we testified at that hearing today.
Yay. I thought for some reason it was just the elder parole bill. I would love parole to come back to Illinois. I'm not optimistic that it will be coming back to Illinois anytime soon. And so until there is some other action or breaking point, like something has to give at a certain point. We're sort of stuck with fighting these cases one at a time. So that's what I got.
Thanks so much, Jen. And I also wanted to invite Renaldo Hudson, if you'd like to speak on these issues. Thanks, Jennifer, for introducing him to us. And thanks, Renaldo, for being here. Would you like to comment?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm definitely honored to be among you, and I'm humbled by Jennifer's representation of me, but the Illinois Prison Project is doing a wonderful job because 37 years. So when you talk about the number of years people spend in prison, you know, just think about what you were doing 37 years ago. I don't know if anyone on the panel could really talk about that in detail, but a few of us, right? But by the grace of God, we're here, and I want to share with the world that people can change, people do change, and it's important for people to understand that a underdeveloped brain can develop, and I'm an example of it. And so I just want people to know that, like, I accept my responsibility. I think it's important that people own up to the stuff when they make bad decisions, you know, not a mistake, but a decision, right? But you can move forward. And so I'm pleased to be able to share with everyone that I get a chance to simply say, thank you for the mighty work that's being done. I love what I heard thus far. I'm definitely not qualified to stand and sit among you all and lecture you on this subject, but I would say there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope to engage you all in the future with this work because I'm all in, and I can't say it enough, the Illinois Prison Project is the best group that's working to save our lives, and I want the world to know that. I'll preach that to the world because there's no one like them. And so I love Jenny and all the people over at the Illinois Prison Project, and I hope to love the rest of you all because you sound like you care about what's going on in the prisons all across this nation. So thank you for allowing me to say a few words. I really appreciate you.
Thanks so much for commenting, Renaldo. And I wanted to mention too, if you'd like to be a part of the Q&A, I think that it would be great for you to join the Q&A if you're comfortable with that. And for everybody else, if Renaldo is okay with this, feel free to send us questions and we can communicate that. Great, thanks so much, everyone. We're going to conclude the panel portion of this event, and now we'll move on to the Q&A. As a reminder, the question should go to Charlotte Rosen. We have a queue going already, so I'll ask the first question that we have here. So I think this is a question for all the panelists. It says, why don't we have parole and why was it eliminated?
Can I take that one? I'll give it a start because this has been my life for the better part of 10 years in Illinois. So, and then, you know, I'm sure Renaldo and Jenny and Marc will have insights as well. But why don't we have parole? So there was a movement in the 1970s that was a national movement among prosecutors and prosecutorial associations to eliminate what they called indeterminate sentencing. And indeterminate sentencing was this idea, and in the 70s that they didn't like it, that you got a sentence and then it was adjustable. And so there was no finality for victim family members. And it was also harder to leverage plea deals and harder to push confessions when somebody thought they could wheedle away their time. I guess that was their argument. And academic papers were written and folks across the nation passed these laws. So in 1978, Illinois eliminated parole. So when Jennifer says, or when Renaldo says, or when Marc says, well, they had parole because it was pre-1978, that's what we mean. It was a policy, we used to have parole and now we don't. I was just on a hearing now about parole. My organization testified a man, not unlike Renaldo, who didn't do as much time as Renaldo. He did 26 years in IDOC. Wendell Robinson, Renaldo, I understand you guys are getting to know each other. Wendell testified, as did our lobbyist. And the main argument that prosecutors have against offering parole or bringing back parole has to do with finality for victims, and has to do with sort of a contract that's entered into. They call it a contract with victims and in front of the court on the day of sentencing. And that should be something that everybody could just wash their hands after that and not have to worry about ever again. They have some constitutional legal arguments that I'm not qualified to comment on in other than a very flippant and derisive manner. Also because I'm not a lawyer and my cat, sorry, cat is marching across the screen. That has to do with the constitutionality based on our state constitution of revesting the General Assembly with the ability to restore parole opportunities for people in the past, people who are serving time now. So any parole conversation that we've had over the past decade, and we've had all of them with all of the legislators and all of the opponents, has been about prospective only parole because this constitutional argument has not been solved. Now, the smart lawyers, the smarty pants lawyers, of which I am sure you are all a member of the Smarty Pants Lawyers Club. The Smarty Pants Lawyers Club says, including, you know, partners at Sidley and, you know, former Supreme Court justices will say, well, of course it's constitutional to revest the General Assembly. We have the Post-Conviction Hearing Act. That's ridiculous. They're stupid. They don't know what they're talking about. Well, guess what? Those people don't have a vote in the Illinois General Assembly. The people in the Illinois General Assembly who have a vote are terrified of letting people out of prison and having, you guys are probably too young to remember this. I am not too young to remember this, the Willie Horton effect. That we're gonna let someone out, they're gonna do something horrible, and I'm gonna wear the jacket for that in the next election. What that, and I've lobbied against the Willie Horton effect every year for the past 10 years of my life. It's as real today as it was the day it happened. And it's this idea that one case, one horrible case where somebody reoffends and does something really violent after they get out of prison justifies locking up hundreds and thousands and thousands and thousands of people for life who wouldn't have done a crime like that. That's the fundamental mentality in politics. And so legislators are actually looking for a way to vote no on a parole bill, and prosecutors give them a way to vote no. Oh, I heard it's not constitutional. Because there's no actual legal settled, you know, no settled law in that area, and we've tried, it's going to remain up in the air. This is why Jenny's work is so deeply, deeply important. One of the things we testified today was we said, of course you can do retroactive reform. Of course it's constitutional. We know you won't because you're chicken. Sorry, don't tell anybody I said that. We know you won't because you're chicken. So let's do some mass clemencies. Let's get behind Jenny Soble's work. Let's do prospective parole. Great. Just like the youthful parole bill we worked on for years and years. We'll do some prospective parole over here. Systematic clemency reviews of these categories of people who've been screwed over by the system, whose families have been screwed over by the system, whose communities have been deprived by having their loved ones locked away for all these decades. That was a really long-winded answer to that question, but it happens to be the thing I'm most passionate about. So now I'm going to stop.
Can I jump in really fast? Yes? Yes? Okay. This is weird, but like I lie awake at night thinking that one day Governor Pritzker is going to mass commute like 200, 300, 4,000 people to make them eligible to go before the parole board. That's how you get parole back for legislators who, as Jobi said, are too chicken to do it the right way. The governor's power here in Illinois is so broad that, for example, Governor Ryan commuted all of the death sentences to make them life eligible. The governor, Governor Rauner and now Governor Pritzker have both commuted folks to a sentence that does not exist in post-1978, which is a life sentence with parole eligibility. And so there's this really clear path forward if only he would take it. So thank you, Jobi.
If I could jump in, I don't pretend to know the history in Illinois, but nationally, I would tweak Jobi's analysis a little bit, because it wasn't just prosecutors and victims groups that were attacking the indeterminate sentence. Many people on the left, many civil rights, civil liberties groups were very critical of indeterminate sentencing and parole because of the arbitrary nature of it and how decisions were made. Decisions that were often racially biased, gender biased, all kinds of ways too. And so there was this kind of coalescing together saying, you know, let's have fixed sentences so everybody knows what it's going to be. The prosecutors and the victims group said fixed and long. The civil liberties and civil rights group said fixed and short, and we know who won that debate. So I'm very supportive of trying to bring back parole in states like Illinois and others facing similar challenges. At the same time, you know, there's no reason to expect that parole in practice will be any less racist or biased in other ways as any other part of the justice system. So we have to go into it with our eyes open, making sure that we have procedures and data and the like to make sure that if we can get it reinstated, it's done in a fair way, a compassionate way, one that's free of bias as much as possible.
Great, thanks everyone. We can go to our next question now, which I believe is also for all the panelists. It says, how do we change the sentiments of people who are, quote, hard on crime and believe in long-term sentencing, considering that many people are not receptive to listening to facts and will spout false information?
I'm happy to get us started again and just say, you know, again, we've been working on this very practically for years. When you're trying to pass a bill, you have to get 177 people to consider it in Illinois, right? You have 159, or you have 118 in the House and you have 59 people in the Senate. So those are the actual human beings whose minds you have to change. So you either, if you can't change their mind, you've got to change enough of their constituents' minds to pressure them, right? So it's pretty easy math in Illinois. And you've got a set amount of time to do that in every session. It's like a sports season. You start in January, you end May 31st, bada bing, bada boom, you got a bill. The problem is getting to those people and changing their minds is literally for us came down to we could get up to in the 50s of votes in the House, but we couldn't get to 60. And so we developed a list of 20 legislators who were Republican, white, non-Chicago legislators who were basically no votes on the youthful parole bill. They would have been no votes. And we brought a lawyer, Scott Main in many cases, who's on this call. We brought someone in Renaldo's situation. So we have gentlemen on our staff who've come out after long periods of time. Marshawn Allen did most of these visits with us. He's now at Fair and Just Prosecution in DC. And we brought a constituent, if we could, somebody who lived in that legislator's community. So what does that require, right? The amount of organization, the amount of logistics, and 4,000 miles we put on our cars in one summer trying to pick up 5 or 6 votes for that bill. That's the only way. I think the big public campaigns are important and culture shifts are important, but having long, deep, real conversations one-on-one with individuals is the only way I've seen that's actually flipped somebody. And we only flipped a few. We didn't flip all 20. We flipped maybe 5 or 6. And that was enough to get us over the hump. But to us, it's the slog. That's the long, hard work of one-on-one meetings and conversations and building relationships.
You know, I would certainly support that. And also, you know, someone who's had a career on research and gathering data and trying to present to policymakers and the public, which I think is very important, it's equally important for us to tell stories also, because we know that when we talk about criminal justice and crime in legislative circles and the like, or on popular TV and things, we define people by the crime they committed. So so-and-so is a murderer, so-and-so is a robber, so-and-so is a burglar. These people have no histories, no past, no circumstances in their lives, nothing. All we know is the crime they committed. And if we define people by the crime they committed, we're going to lose every time, because the crime sounds scary and it lets people's stereotypes and imaginations run away. Instead, if we can show and talk to real human beings who've made mistakes, just as we've all made mistakes in our lives, that's a different way. That's a way to get people to understand how could a person have ended up committing a serious crime like this. It doesn't excuse the crime that was committed, but it gives us some insight into why they did it, and hopefully gives some insight into how we could prevent other people from ending up in those circumstances. So I think we need to have a mix of approaches on that.
I think if maybe Renaldo wants to chime in here. His story is like, for me, it is sort of the classic example of how you take somebody who's tough on crime, we're all tough on crime, and sort of change their minds, because you can really see the humanity behind a person. And Renaldo has the most unlikely allies. Renaldo, will you speak on this? I don't want to speak for you. Maybe how you got those folks aligned with you and who they are.
I think it's important, and I like what was said, that you have to tell the story and you have to be willing to cross the bridge. Like, I understand that I have to be able to look across at someone that might want to scream at me and say, you horrible, horrible person. You did a horrible, horrible thing. But then when they begin to recognize that I still have humanity, that there's something loving left in me. And so when I began to talk with people, and you know, Jenny, we began to actually develop a very eclectic group of people that people would never expect to come across and say, well, wait a minute, what went wrong? What happened with this human being? You know, why is it so easy to throw people away? And it's hard to throw people away that smile. You know, you say, hey, wait a minute, he's not frowning and he don't want to just grab everyone. You know, but then I smile and say, listen, I've learned that I have to take responsibility for my actions. I've learned that I need to be able to conjugate a verb. I've learned that I need to read a book and recognize that the Constitution includes me. And the only reason it excludes me is because I don't exercise my right to vote. And so when you talk about law enforcement, when you talk about legislators, they're most threatened when they begin to recognize that inmates are starting to be educated. And we're now talking about voting. Like, I'm on this big thing now saying everyone that I know that's ever been in prison, vote. Because I'm so proud of the fact that my governor, Governor Pritzker, the fixer, and I said that publicly, I love him, right, was brave enough to say, despite politics, I think anyone that has been in prison for decades and who have rehabilitated himself should get a chance to say to society, your taxpayer dollars did not go to waste, in the case of Renaldo Hudson. And there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of people that need a chance. And so I can't say it enough that we have to be willing to cross the bridge. We have to be willing to go into the state's attorney office and say, hey, listen, you're an elected official. You're not an Allen unto yourself. You know, hey, Mr. Legislator, you may be afraid of Willie Horton, but you ain't got no business being afraid of Renaldo Hudson. You know, and I'm in front of you right now saying, I'm speaking in behalf of all the young people who don't have a voice. And so I want to add my voice to the stage and say, rehabilitation is possible and good representation is possible. And I know it, and I'm a witness of it in the case of, I can't say it enough, IPP. And people should back them, support them, help us as much as you can, because it's thousands of people that need help. So yes, we can do it. I still believe we can do it. I'm very optimistic about it. I'm excited about learning this technology that I'm really still struggling with. I was trying to unmute myself and I'm like, Lord have mercy, 37 years, and I'm on this telephone talking to people like the Jetsons. And this is so funny to me. So people need to know that my humanity didn't die with my incarceration. I committed a horrible crime when I was a kid on drugs, but I decided to stop beating myself up and said, if I really have changed, then my conduct will reflect it. And my conduct reflected that I love life and I would never disrespect life again. And so I'm the flag, and I'm willing to wave the flag for the rest of the brothers and sisters. Come this way. There's still people that believe in us. So yes, we can win. We just got to get in the fight. And I'll keep talking if y'all don't turn this thing off. I am not afraid to preach. I love you. So if anybody have any questions, I'm open to any question. My life is an open book. They've already told everything that they can say about me. So you can't embarrass me.
Thanks so much, Renaldo, for your comments. And also feel free to address any of the questions being made so far too. So feel free to come in whenever you'd like.
Yes.
So I'm going to, we have the next question and the one after I'm going to combine because they seem to be connected. So They say if sentencing is meant to do something more than just incapacitate, for shorter sentences to work, how do conditions inside prisons need to change? And relatedly, what do the panelists think then of recent calls to abolish prisons?
Well, let me say this. People have to understand that people need the opportunity to educate themselves. So if taxpayers are going to pay for me to have a bunk, then I would suggest they pay for me to have a book, right? When I sit on that bunk, so that I can at least get a GED. I can at least walk out of prison with a certificate saying I was trained and I'm now ready to be a taxpayer, you know? I think it's a dangerous thing when you use language about defunding. I can see reallocating. I think the language should change, you know, reallocate funds that are better serve the people, you know, because I think that there's a very large group of people that do a wonderful job. They're just scared of the small group of people that are allowed to be bullies, you know? And so we have to start putting light on the bullies, just like you do it if an offender do something, they put us in segregation. If a staff member do something, they promote them. And so we have to begin to say to people, taxpayers' dollars mean you work for the people. And I don't understand that, you know? So people that think that people shouldn't get a second chance, that how do you deal with be harsher? I would say to them, you have the right to feel that way. But remember, life has a way of coming back, you know? And so be careful what you do to others, because it can come back on you, you know? And that's just my take on it. But I think everyone have the right to feel the way they feel. But I'm asking and I'm welcoming people to come across the bridge and let's have a conversation and see if you still feel the same way after the real conversation with a person that spent 37 years in prison, who understand the pain of sitting in a cell with the door slammed and someone's kicking and screaming and hollering, and you're saying, man, Lord, how did I get here? Because there's a lot of crying, and maybe deservingly, some people could say that. But I think it's important that people begin to remember, what if that was your son? What if that was your daughter? You know, on both sides of the argument. So I'm very empathetic toward people of crime that are victims of crime. I always say to people, the victim of my offense, Mr. Peterson, deserved so much more than what my life brought into his life. But I'm going to honor him by saying to the world, I'll never, ever, ever make a decision that dishonor and disrespect humanity again. So that's all I have for him. And that's all I have for the rest of the world is give us a chance to pay the price of committing crime. Let us become citizens that pay taxes and not just sit in cells wasting people's resources.
You know, thank you, Renaldo, for those very thoughtful words. Let me just say something about the question of prison abolition. You know, it seems to me as an aspirational goal, we should all be prison abolitionists. You know, if we recognize that sending people to prison is putting our fellow human beings in cages, I don't care what your political perspective is or your thoughts on crime or anything, wouldn't we all want to live in a society where we didn't feel the need to put people in cages? Now, that's not going to happen tomorrow or next year or in our lifetimes either, but as a goal to reach towards, to get to a society that more equitably distributes resources and opportunities and the like, if prison abolition becomes our goal for, let's say, 100 years from now, what steps do we need to take, both in the criminal justice system, but more importantly, outside of the criminal justice system, to move along that path to eventual abolition? And yes, it's messy. Yes, there are people today who've committed some very serious crimes. We know all of that, but we also know that the things we could be doing that are much, much more effective in creating opportunity in dealing with interpersonal conflict, and that's what we want to get behind, all of us.
Yeah, I want to add to that, Marc, really a comment about race. And Renaldo said, you have to imagine these are your children. And this is something that was hard for me to face as a white person who, you know, hasn't faced discrimination and sort of humiliation based on my race my whole life. I have not faced that. But one of the hardest things to see when I first started doing this work, because I first started visiting men at Menard Correctional Center, which is in Chester, Illinois, in the southern part of the state. Scott, you hearing me here? You drive up to this late 1800s building, and it's a Gothic. It's just a horrible, horrible. You wouldn't put your worst enemy in this building. And as you drive up, you feel like you know you're on a movie set. There's a quarry behind the prison. You can't escape. The Mississippi River's on one side, a quarry on the other. And you park your car where they tell the visitors to park. And they force visitors to park on the far side of the parking lot from where the entrance to the visiting room is. And I've taken my children, my husband, I've taken family members to visit my friends. And every time my stomach drops as I walk through that parking lot and look at the Confederate flag bumper stickers and the Trump stickers and the Fraternal Order of Police stickers and the racist dog whistle stickers of the day on the trucks and cars of staff leading into the facility. I don't think prison isn't neutral. It's not confinement alone, and it's not positive. It's not rehabilitation. Prison is harmful to the people in it. It's a horrific system in the state of Illinois, and probably in many states. I can only speak to ours. It is not even pretending to be rehabilitative in most places. And the fact is, most people are okay with this because it is Black people we are sending there. And I think we need to be really clear that if our prisons were full of white people, they wouldn't look the way they look. And it makes me sick to say it, but it's the truth. And every single time we have a conversation about sentencing and crime and we start talking about the nature of crime, I think about going to Alabama last year and visiting the memorial to lynchings in the Jim Crow era. And Julie, my friend Julie, whose son is serving time in prison, and I walking through arm in arm, just weeping. And the reasons people were lynched aren't too dissimilar from the reasons we're putting people away now. It's white fear of Black dangerousness. It's white fear of Black dangerousness. It's an assumption of guilt. And I tell you, if the 5 kids in Lake County who had been playing around near a guy's car in his driveway had been white kids from Highland Park, say, or from Evanston, and not Black kids from West Englewood, that man wouldn't have fired into that group. There wouldn't have been felony murder charges for 5 kids. There wouldn't have been a dead boy bleeding out in the driveway. Our system is built on this. It's built on it, and we can't ignore it.
I want to jump in to add just like one more layer to that, and that is the effect of long-term incarceration on prison conditions, right? When you have a system where 1 in 4 people in the prison systems is serving a sentence longer than 20 years, we have truly treated them sort of, the criminal legal system has deemed them disposable, right? And so they go in and they don't come back out. And so there is this divestment in their education, in their well-being, in their health, because they're not coming out. Right. And so our entire system has treated more than 10,000 people, right, every day in our state as literally not worth caring for. And I think you eliminate these extraordinarily excessive sentences, you change the narrative around long-term incarceration and back-end review, and you force sunshine into that space, and you force folks to reckon with the kind of care that we're providing people, the kind of programming and education and opportunities, because you have set up a system that no longer treats people as throwaways.
Thanks, everyone. So I think we have time for one last question. So this next question says, how has COVID impacted your work? Has it created new challenges, or has it created any possibilities, especially with efforts to get people released? And relatedly, what are the stakes of this upcoming election as it pertains to the criminal legal system?
Maybe I'll start with, you
go
want to
ahead.
go?
No, you go ahead. I'll follow up. I have a couple things, but I can wait.
I'll keep it to just the releases. How about that? Cool. So it's been, in some ways, extremely helpful. We've managed to get some people out, like a teeny tiny group of people who would never have gotten out under other circumstances. And at least here in Illinois, it is not the case that Governor Pritzker is letting people out who are vulnerable to COVID, because he's definitely not. But he is letting out people who probably should, who most definitely should have been released anyway, but probably would not have been released until the end of his administration. On the whole, like mass releasing of elderly people who aren't a risk to society and yet are extremely vulnerable and leading to the overcrowding of our prison system, which leads to mass spread, we've gotten nowhere, absolutely nowhere. There is pending litigation in federal court. We're a part of it. It's ongoing. It's painful. There are settlement negotiations. They are slow. They are painful. I am not optimistic about any of them. Go for it,
okay, I'll follow up. I just popped a report into the chat that we produced earlier this summer about racial inequity in the early release program that the governor supervised. And I'll say one thing about it, which is they didn't release as many people as they thought they did, and they released a lot more white folks than they did black folks. And we can kind of go through that, but we don't have time. So what I will say is this: our work as a little nonprofit organization trying to pass laws changed irrevocably because our legislature went away. They shut down the legislative session in March, smack in the middle of 100% of our work, being to try to pass laws to change extreme sentencing conditions in Illinois. So we have most of our funding is general support. We have built ourselves on the theory that we need to be able to do our jobs without so many conditions that we can't breathe on any given day. And so we were able to pivot almost completely in mid-March to working solely on COVID policy in prisons, advocating with the governor, doing research on how IDOC is performing. IDOC is performing horrendously. I've had meetings with them that they really don't know. I think because the system is so poorly managed when this new administration came in a year ago, because it's been a victim of its own, it's dying under its own weight in that bureaucracy. It's just a terrible, terrible bureaucracy. And having worked in government before, I can tell you it's one of the worst I've seen. They're incapable of doing simple things well. They're incapable of implementing simple changes well. It's that boring and stupid. It's not even, some of it isn't even mean-spirited. Even when they're trying to save people's lives, they can't. So our challenge now and how our work has changed has been trying to figure out ways to help them that are within their capacity. Remember when Jenny and I started talking about COVID recommendations, we were talking about early releases within the law. We don't want to have to, nobody can change a law right now. So how do we get people out within the law as it stands? Okay, here are the recommendations. Well, now we're 2 steps back. How can we get them to do better data analysis when they don't have data systems that work for them? How can we get them to manage a testing system when they can't get guards, correctional officers, to wear their masks after going to parties all weekend? How do we do that? How do you manage that system? So that's not a legal problem. That's a human change management problem that they are simply incapable of doing. And so keeping the pressure on and keeping the solutions coming has been our new life over the past several months.
And I'll just add one question was, what are the stakes in the election? The stakes in the election are as high as they will have ever been, and the fate of the world depends on it. So do what you can between now and election day.
And I'll add to that, don't ignore down ballot in Illinois. There's some really critical judicial elections, so make sure you go to Injustice Watch, injusticewatch.org, and look at the judicial reviews. There are some really important state's attorneys races. If RC4 has endorsed a candidate in Lake County, we're working on endorsements in Kane County and some of the other contested state's attorneys races. But here's a challenge to you all. You're all law students. We did a candidate questionnaire in this for our C4, and we sent to all 102 prosecutorial races, we sent a candidate questionnaire, and there's probably only 10 or 20 contested races in the state of Illinois for state's attorneys. So Renaldo was saying, how do you change someone's mind? You say, you're elected. We're electing you. Well, if they never have a challenger, if no one steps up to run against these, in some cases, scumbags, we get what we get out of our democracy if we don't run. So I want you to, even though you want to be a good-hearted public defender, each and every one of you, I know you do, we need some progressive prosecutors in those offices. So get running and move to somewhere rural, because those people have a freaking huge impact on what we do. I'll just end with saying that we just did testimony against a man from White County. The state's attorney from White County, Illinois, was the key testimony for the State's Attorneys Association and why we shouldn't do these good criminal justice reforms that we're all talking about. His county is 96% white, and there are only 14,000 people in it. And he's about as far away from the problems that we're all talking about as he could be. And he's the one setting policy. Does he have a challenger in his election? No. So vote, 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 and run, run, run for office. Thank you.
Just a note to say you can run for state's attorney after having only been a public defender. Happens in Brooklyn.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jobi, Jenny, Marc, and Renaldo for this amazing panel and conversation. And thanks to everybody for joining us today in the audience. So just very quickly as we conclude, I want to mention our upcoming panel on October 13th. We'll be having another roundtable, the second roundtable of the series on solitary confinement, and we'll have some really excellent speakers join us then. So please look out for our RSVP email. Great. Well, thanks so much, everyone.